almost day, a little bit better than yesterday. I flew in from Seattle yesterday after seeing my one-year-old granddaughter, and we got all the way from Seattle to Midway in about 3 hours, and then we flew back down. We didn't land at Midway. We were in a landing pattern that got aborted a couple times. We ended up flying to St. Louis, picking up more gas.
Wow.
Staying in St. Louis for a while and then coming back. So it was about 3 hours and 5 minutes from Seattle to Midway environments, and then another about 4 or 5 hours going down to St. Louis, picking up gas, coming back. And
wow.
Yeah, so it was kind of crazy. I had time to polish up a few flying jokes, so I thought I'd start out with some of those. But thanks for joining up with Science Sunday, coming in today. We love to talk about science here, and I wanted to kind of get a more biological tint to things. We've been doing a lot of physics things and astronomical things and so on, but I wanted to kind of get back to some ideas.
I see where you're going with that.
So, like I said, I flew to Seattle yesterday, and then St. Louis, and then back here, and boy, my arms are really tired.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering about this, and I was thinking, as things develop, do you think invisible planes will ever be a thing?
Invisible planes? Wonder Woman had one.
Yeah?
In theory.
Oh, yeah? I really can't see them taking off. There is a good joke from up top.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to talk today about the evolution of flight. And
got a question?
Yes.
Can we take masks off in here, or I think there was a question about whether there's a consensus. So you're not wearing masks, and you are.
Typically, yeah, here we do. I would say that if you're within 10 feet, I'm not going to, and no one within 10 feet of you, it's fine with me or someone that you house with.
The church policy is if it's a small group and there's unanimous consent. Yeah. So anybody uncomfortable without masks?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Great. Good. Thanks. So when you think about the evolution of flight, and I want to use this as kind of a jumping off point, a leaping point, let's say, a takeoff point to talk some more about some biology and evolution and genetics and things like that in the next few months. And when you think about it, flight really seems like an amazing skill, just the capacity of flight. And humans have long dreamed, really, of gaining an ability to fly, right? We aren't really constructed or evolved to fly, although with enough time, anything can happen, really, in evolution. But some of the past greatest minds, not least Leonardo da Vinci, have yearned to rise freely into the air and design machines to allow them to do so. This never would have worked, but it's using our mind, which is one of our great evolutionary developments. Literature throughout the ages has dealt with flight, from Icarus, who crafted wings from feathers and wax. He had a kind of a poor outcome of that one as well. To Pegasus, the flying horse, the flying carpets of the Arabian Nights, and even King Solomon, who had a shining silk carpet big enough to carry 40,000 of his men to wherever he wanted to do battle.
I don't remember that story.
It's in the Bible.
Really?
Yeah.
Must be true.
Yeah. I said literature. Muhammad flew from Mecca to Jerusalem on a night journey, riding the Buraq, a winged horse with the face of, some say a man, some say a woman.
It's hard to tell.
Just by the face,
Yeah.
Witches, fairies, angels and dragons, levitation, all sorts of different things. Flying beings capture our imagination. The concept gives figurative wings to our dreams. In a way, nowadays, right now, my thoughts and my image even is in front of many of you because it's soaring into space and traveling through the ether, coming in and landing at your computer terminal, and you're sitting at home and seeing me flying, and my thoughts flying to you. Our words can leap and fly across continents and oceans in seconds. Flight is amazing. We and other animals have tamed gravity, in our case with technology, and in other animals' cases with their biology, to rise above solid ground. But why? Why would that be? I've got to say that at some point here, pretty quickly, we found out when I got in here today that a few of my slides got misdirected and misaimed, so I'm going to have to kind of filter through and discuss and describe what's on my slides. I had it all pretty well set before I left for Seattle, and then I came back and did a little bit more work on it last night and this morning and so on, and something occurred in my final save. But in evolutionary terms, when you talk about flight or any other attribute, ability or developmental case of an animal or plant, really, a creature becomes the way it is because those changes, those adaptations make it more capable of passing its genetic package on to its descendants. A new trait passes on because it gives a reproductive advantage to the organism that acquires it. Survival is important. So if a trait helps you survive, that's important. But even more important than survival for any species, any organism, plant or animal, in Darwinian terms, is survival of the genetic code that's inside it, right? So as long as it can pass on its genetic code, then better than it could before, then that's an adaptation, a positive development. You can think of that's why maybe people senesce in older age. Maybe there's things that happen. Our cells break down in ways, or things happen that don't allow us to age as well as we'd like to. But there's no reason for evolution to want to adapt our bodies to age well, to age properly, to age how we'd like.
Reproductive age.
Once you're past reproductive age. Those who aren't going to be reproducing don't, there's no evolutionary advantage for them to senesce in a graceful or gradual manner or anything like that.
Or perpetual, for that matter.
Yeah. So survival of the genetic code is what's important here. You know, there's one, I had a little film here of gannets. Gannets are a bird that are really, if you think of them, they're the Stuka dive bombers of the bird bird world. They soar above the ocean looking for little signs of a school of fish, often sardines. And then they dive down in from heights of 30 to 50 meters at speeds approaching 60 miles an hour. And they hit the water, and they go down through the water in this beautifully streamlined production. I know Richard Dawkins has said that it's one of the most amazing things scientifically or artistically to see as these things get in this beautiful, perfectly aerodynamic shape to hit the water at those kinds of speeds. They go as deep as 30 feet down into the water, and they plunge into these schools of herring and sardines and capture them, right? They usually work in tandem with dolphins that are underneath, keeping the sardines near the top.
Do they do this for the halibut?
Yeah, they do it for the halibut too.
Yeah. Okay. On porpoise?
On
yeah.
porpoise. So as they hit, they're hitting at immense speeds, and actually they're doing damage to their eyes every time they hit. It's a structural damage to their eyes. And it's very common for gannets as they age to become blind. So blind gannets are just hanging on the cliffs and they can't eat anymore. They starve and fall away. But by that time, there's been the advantage of flight and this diving technique that gets them the food while they're young that makes them have healthier chicks, healthier young, and passes on this tendency. So it's kind of an example of how evolutionary adaptations are meant to help the genes pass on to their offspring, not necessarily to make gannets or any other bird have their best life after they have done their reproductive task. So they often, like I say, go blind from the progressive damage done to their eyes from this activity, and they starve to death. So is this an evolutionary success story, seeing as they are shortening their lives by diving? In evolutionary terms, you'd have to say yes. They are furthering their species. It's an adaptation. That's something that they can do. They can catch these fish that other birds cannot, and that helps them survive as a species. So if we want to talk about, and maybe as a fast, if you'd ask, is there a benefit? Is it good for organisms to develop the skill of flying? I'd say, as kind of a fast answer, what would you say, yes or no? Is it a benefit to fly?
Well, scientifically, is there a niche available to a flying creature that isn't available to an aquatic or land-based creature?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as it gives it an expanded capability to gain food, to gain capacities to feed its offspring and to develop and reproduce.
Or protect its offspring, or any kind of advantage with reproduction or survival.
So really, when you ask what's the good of flying, I think Scott's getting towards it, you're really meaning, in a Darwinian sense at least, does flying increase reproductive success, right? You're looking at reproductive success. So let's look at that. What benefits come to organisms that can overcome gravity? Well, we're thinking of, and typically you have to kind of break away from this, it's not just birds, but there's insects, right? Insects can travel greater distances more easily, right? They can get to a bigger, wider, diverse supply of food. There's some moths that have sensitive antennae that can detect a female moth from over 3 miles away. And this capacity to fly, obviously, gives them the capacity to meet their future mate. Their sense organism can isolate the chemical identifier exuded in these pheromones, even if it's diluted to 1 part in a quadrillion. So at that level, it can detect and sense and home in on this mate, potential mate, from 3 miles away, and then fly and acquire, right, reproductive success.
That's like homeopathic levels right there.
1 part in a quadrillion. So other things that flight allows, some even heavy birds like peacocks and turkeys can muster enough lift to get off the ground, maybe, and roost in a tree at night and evade their predators. Others can flit from limb to limb in a tree to find food. Raptors and vultures soar many miles, hardly flapping a wing, so they're not using energy up, using their keen eyes to find food to scavenge on the ground. Bats and swifts and dragonflies catch insects with daring, skillful maneuvers. Flight allows many species of birds to migrate long distances. I just heard there was a new record set quantified for a bird that flew from the Aleutian Islands all the way down to, usually they roost in, or they stay our winter, the summer, down in New Zealand area. But this bird took a right turn and went down to Tasmania, actually, when it got to the end of its flight. So it added another 500 kilometers or something like that, 300 more miles to what's been the longest recorded flight of a migratory flight of a bird.
Non-stop flight, mind you.
Non-stop.
Yeah.
And it's known to be non-stop because these birds don't have webbed feet. They cannot take off from water. And they put a transmitter on it. Usually they could only, up till now, they could only put transmitters on larger birds like albatrosses and things like that, because the weight was so excessive that it would damage the bird's capacity to fly. This was a bird that I think weighed 200 grams, weighed 400 grams at the start of the trip and weighed about 200 grams at the end of the trip. They use up half of their body weight flying. I think we talked in an earlier Science Sunday how they almost reabsorb things that they aren't using. They reabsorb their ovaries and testes and the sex organs. They don't have them at all, and then they blossom back out again after they've fed again. Kind of an amazing thing. But yeah, this capacity to fly these long distances and migrate, so it actually has feeding in what we call our summertime up north in the Aleutian Islands, where it's a lot of potential food sources there, and then migrates all the way down. So this whole idea of migration in birds is allowed by flight, which gives them safety and reproductive success, right? Flowers manufacture nectar that insects and birds and bats all can more efficiently utilize because of flight, right? Without flight, we wouldn't have flowers like we see now. Flowers have evolved to co-evolve with the capacity of flying insects and birds and bats to utilize this energy source. Flowers wouldn't look the way they do at all if there wasn't flight. Flight allows some birds to roost on cliff ledges and rock faces that are safe from dangerous creatures. Wings allowed animals to get to islands that most four-legged creatures couldn't get to as well. So islands populated completely differently than other areas, continental islands, or I'm talking more about the oceanic islands that were separated by hundreds of miles from the continent. But then they were populated and have a whole different range of species that live on oceanic islands than
like
do in other places.
Darwin's finches.
Darwin's finches, and all the way down to fruit flies and things. Drosophilias have been studied on Madagascar and Hawaii. There's species there that have evolved to fit into that whole ecosystem there. So birds that can rest on cliff ledges and rock faces that are safe from dangerous creatures and get to islands that most four-legged creatures couldn't approach. This meant that birds and bats became the dominant species on many isolated islands, which had significant evolutionary results. Great diversity and a variety of birds on remote islands is common. If you want to see places with a great variety of birds and insects, an oceanic island is a place that has amazing diversity. I think there's some down in South America that have like 200 species of different kinds of birds living on one small island area. So it seems clear that flying is a hugely useful activity, and it provides great benefits to those that develop it. When you think of it, what it really does is it literally opens up a new dimension, right? A new dimension for life on Earth, and therefore it really magnifies opportunities for evolutionary diversity. Without flight, this would be a much less diverse planet. So then how do we theorize that wings and feathers developed? Really, the answer is slowly and one small increment at a time. After the scientific miracles of the Cambrian development 500 million years ago, the fossil record and explorations of DNA revealed a gradualism that Lyell, one of Darwin's associates, talked about in the early 1800s. 500 million years ago, the first notochords, the first creatures with any kind of central spinal cord type thing existed. Only 500 million years ago. Evidence of feathers has been found on a significant number of dinosaurs, really. I had a really interesting picture of an artist's recreation of what they thought dinosaurs might look like. And that's been a new development in the last really 20 years, I'd say, the understanding of how important feathers were. And feathers were thought to be an early development that maybe was insulation for early types of dinosaurs and creatures like that.
And signaling, right? Sexual selection and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one thing I kind of wanted to get into and talk about in the next few times as well, too, natural selection and sexual selection. But they were most likely for heat retention, potentially sexual selection, but over the years, over the eons, natural selection continued its long process. Right? So feathers were not evolved to aid flight, not originally manufactured to aid flight, but then evolved and used in a variety of different ways, and one was for flight. So if flight is so good for many animals, like we stated earlier, how did non-flying organisms come to do it? And how often did it do it, and in what ways did it do it? Really, it developed in many creatures in different ways and at different times. I'm missing a slide that talks about it, but let's see, we ought to be able to name many of the creatures that have developed flight capacities. Okay, so from the crowd, can you name birds, bats, insects? And there's really one other time in history that flight was developed. Yeah?
And there seem to be some that are on their way, like flying squirrels and flying fish.
Squirrels are more gliders than flyers.
Yeah, gliders. And that's a good point I'm sure you're going to talk about.
Right, right. So really, I mean, the amazing one are bats that have developed that capacity there too. The only mammal that really has true flight capabilities. Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of dipping into my slides and missing the ones. I had pictures of all those. But when did animals develop flight? If you think of those four, insects, pterosaurs, bats, and birds, which one developed flight first?
Insects.
Insects. Insects developed it first 450 million years ago. Okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
dragonflies, Joanne says dragonflies that were about 6 feet.
Right, dragonflies had a 6-foot wingspan. When you think of that, that's just amazing. And part of that was because of the heavy levels of oxygen in the atmosphere at the time that allowed them to have the energy and the power to do these things. A lot of animals grew to large sizes in those times.
And forest fires were extraordinary.
Right,
Yeah, lots of oxygen for fuel.
right, right. So that's 450 million years ago. Let me get back to my less compelling slide. So after that, who would be next? After insects? And really no dinosaurs ever developed, well, I should be careful with that. The dinosaurs that were around were never flying, right? They were actually pterosaurs. And the virtual difference between them is pterosaurs, it gets to be an anatomical and structural difference. The hip bones were different. There were a few other different aspects to. Yeah, yeah, they were reptiles of a nature. Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you get real technical, dinosaurs aren't really lizards or reptiles because they're
Yeah, therosaurs,
warm-blooded.
sauropods. There's a couple
Right.
different families.
So, anyways, that's the pterosaurs were the next, and the pterosaurs are the definition of flying creatures. And I don't know, I don't want to be wrong and say they were reptiles or whatever, but. So, and they came along around, pterosaurs came along around 165 million years ago, okay? So I know I used to talk pretty regularly about life on Earth. If you talk about the span of life on Earth, as about 4 billion years ago, life started on Earth, right? The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, but if we're only talking about the span of life on Earth, you can think of the span of your arm. And if you think of the beginning of time here, and you talk about 4 billion years, then about here is the first billion, second billion, third billion, fourth billion. So actually there was nothing more complex life on Earth than bacteria until around 500 million years ago, somewhere around here, okay? Then we're talking about the development of insects 450 million years ago, still not even to your wrist yet, but pretty far along when we finally get to those. And then you get to pterosaurs, 165. Well, if this is 500, 250, somewhere around here in all the span of life
Mike,
on Earth.
your arm is off the camera here, so you want to move this way a little. There you go.
Somewhere around here, thank you,
Yep.
is the development of pterosaurs, okay? And then you go on further from that, and you talk about the next one of the four developing creatures with flight capabilities would be birds, right? And birds were about 80 million years ago, okay? And finally, bats developed this capacity about 20 million years ago, okay? So 20 million years ago is pretty far along towards today. If we talk about, so that's something to keep in mind, those four basic organisms that have all developed this, and this is something I want to go with further, and it's on this slide, this idea of convergent evolution. And convergent evolution means organisms that move towards the same capacities, but in different ways, at different capacity. They can do the same things. They've gained the same capacity, let's say flight in this case. So they've converged toward a same skill, but they haven't been on the same evolutionary path to do it. So each of these creatures developed this capacity to for flight in a different way, notwithstanding what the others were doing way before that or at different times than them. They all converge towards a similar capacity.
I want to see you avoid talking about physics as you delve into this topic.
Oh, you'll make me, I think. Here's some physics. A couple of basic rules. What are you going to do if you're going to fly as an organism? I may anthropomorphize this a little bit, but as creatures develop, if they see an evolutionary advantage to flying, and they don't see it, right? It's because it's random. So if an evolutionary advantage accrues to them because they can fly or can move towards flying, that capacity, what are the things that will make them more adept or more easily to do it? What are some things that are important to a creature as it is trying to fly, right?
How long it can stay in the air, for
Right.
example.
Well, that depends how far you drop it from.
Yeah.
So Joanne's saying the first one, which is stay small, right? Smaller creatures. And that, if you think of it, it kind of goes back to almost like children's building blocks. You think of something that's, let's say, a square inch on a side, right? It's fairly small, and if you have a square that way and you paint all four corners, it's one square unit, and it takes up 6 square inches to take it, right? But if you go out by double that, you're going twice in width, twice in length, and twice in height, all right? You are increasing the weight and the volume of that 8 times, right? But you're nowhere near increasing the volume and weight of you're nowhere near increasing the surface area that this takes. So you have much more weight to get up with the same amount of surface area. And if you go out 10 times and 10 times and 10 times, it's astronomical. You're getting 1,000 times heavier, right? But getting not significantly more surface area. You're only getting, 600 square inches of surface area? So, one is that. And I think that probably even the famous painters of the Renaissance didn't realize that when they painted the Annunciation and an angel talking to Mary and telling her how she was going to have a baby, and you see Gabriel coming to talk to her about this. And actually, if if you size that as a creature gets to be the size of a human, the wings it would take for it to be able to fly would have filled up that and the next painting over in wherever this thing was hung. Yes. Richard Dawkins, I believe, did an extension. He took that painting and he had someone artistically draw on the wings that would make that work. And it's a pretty interesting picture to see. These wings that have to be massive to carry the weight of a person. So a fairy, that's this big or something flitting around like Tinkerbell, that's not as much a problem for flight as an angel that's the size of human beings, right? So
you're arguing that angels are really small. That's your conclusion?
No.
Okay.
We better look more carefully at angels' capacities. Okay. All right. So then that's the first step, is stay as small as possible. If you need to be large, like some of these creatures were, we'll see some amazing creatures. If you need to be large and still try to fly, the only solution for that is to massively increase your surface area relative to your weight, right? So you can decrease your weight significantly by hollow bones, a variety of different things like that. But surface area, increasing surface area is going to be a massive importance in success. So I had some pictures. You're probably familiar with, they didn't make it through on the slides, but you probably know about the flying squirrels that aren't really flying, they're gliding. They basically climb up a tree just like a regular squirrel, and they have the capacity to glide over to another tree, and they lose altitude on their way down, but they can soar for incredible distances, and then they land on a lower tree and climb up again for that. Another example I had is a biplane or a triplane, okay? And a biplane or triplane has the capacity to support more air under it, to give more surface area, to get lift and raise you up. And so early
Some
planes,
insects do that, right?
What's that?
Some insects do that.
Yeah.
They have layers, like dragonflies, multiple, not just two wings.
Another one, I had a really interesting picture of a flying fish, and again, it didn't make the slides. My slides got botched up coming in today. So apologies to you specifically, Joanne. You're looking very concerned. So the flying fish are amazing too. Again, they don't fly, but they seem to appear very close to it. They can launch themselves out of water and travel for a long ways and then land back down in the water.
And they flap, I think.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
unlike the flying squirrels, the flying fish are actually, busily flapping. So
Right, right.
They're on their way.
Right. And that's been something that scientists would say there's not much reason to believe why they couldn't evolve into that capacity. Fish could develop the speed to get takeoff speed and then get out of the water. There has to be an evolutionary benefit to it though, right? Which maybe just being able to flap and get 30 or 40 feet and
Away
then
from
back into
predators.
the water gets
Yeah.
you away from predators and so on. But then the predators have developed in this arms race that always develops. There's predators that look for flying fish being chased by dolphins, and then there's, I'm not sure if they're gannets or gulls or something that actually, and these flying fish are generally, again, not big. They're,
Foot long or so.
yeah, maybe, and maybe less. And so they're moving along, and then gulls can catch them. They swoop and catch them in the air. So they're kind of caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, I guess.
Ah.
Stabilizers too, John is saying that, or the main purpose of them is stabilizers.
Right, so they can stay straight and level as opposed to
Right.
run sideways and down and in or whatever.
Ailerons and tail flaps.
Right, but keep them stable, they can get further distance.
Right, as they develop these things, John is saying that this capacity lets them keep level, flying level and true, and glide for longer distances that way, not go spiraling out of control, and that helps them evolutionarily as well.
Yeah, birds have that, right? They have control surfaces essentially on their wings and tails. that
Right, when
they've
you look
evolved.
at the capacities, what feathers can do, and the adaptations, the evolutionary adaptations of what the flight feathers do, and bats, how they can constrict, because, you know, they just have a flat space, but they're flapping and flying, and they actually have musculature in their wings that actually contracts, and so it kind of tightens up, you know, it doesn't make
can
loose
make
areas.
cups or flat
Right.
planes, yeah.
Right. Yeah, John's talking about stabilizers. A colugo, I don't know if you know of that.
I haven't heard of a colugo.
They're called flying lemurs. They aren't really lemurs, but they're from Madagascar, and they actually have wings, or flaps really, not wings, flaps that extend throughout their whole body. And if you look at them, it's too bad I don't have this picture again, but Google colugos, C-O-L-U-G-O, and they seem like they're almost all flaps, and you can actually see their body inside, their tiny little legs and their guts and then their head, and they seem like they're almost all wing, like a parasailer or something like that. And just amazing capacities to soar through the trees of Madagascar, I believe. You're talking about people that fly in parasailers, or who you? Oh, there's people in like squirrel suits you're talking about, and they jump off like fjords in Norway and go soaring down. Yeah, that's not my life. That's an evolutionary problem there, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's Darwinian selection maybe going on. That's amazing to see if you've seen those things. People jumping off, I think they call them squirrel suits, and they jump off of high spaces and go soaring. They go right past rock faces, and generally I looked into that a little bit. And
Usually they go right past rock faces.
right. Well, what they may have like 20 tries, and first time they do it, they go 150 feet from the rock face, and they find out what the wind's like, and then they kind of work their way down. And I mean, they're still very adept flyers, and then they realize what the winds are doing as they come around there. So the next time they fly 75 feet from it, and then the next time they fly 30 feet from it, and then they're going, finally, after their 10th time, they're going 4 feet from it, and that's when they take the pictures that they show on, on YouTube and so on. But they develop these, knowledge of what's happening in the wind conditions and so on by taking preliminary flights. And yeah, a lot of different ways for humans. Like I said, humans have always wanted to imitate flight. We haven't achieved, self-powered flight. Right. The soaring, they imitate animals. I'm thinking that the closest humans have come to self-powered flight has been the modified bicycle that actually flew over the English Channel, the Gossamer Albatross, I think it was called. And that's an interesting thing to see. And they had a real in-shape young bicyclist that was trained, and he barely made it over. He was like inches above the waves at some time, and they were yelling in his headphones for pedal harder, and he probably wanted to throw the headphones out because of the extra weight, for one. But the Gossamer Albatross, yeah, and that was back in the 80s or so, I think. And so, flight has been, means of gaining flight have been pretty amazing. So developed in many creatures in different ways and at different times. When we look at the fossil record, it's so incomplete that it gives us clues but not complete examples of every step of flight. As life evolved, organisms adapted and acclimated themselves to their environment. They specialized and differentiated and filled available niches. Those that did that best would have survived. By survived, again, really I mean their genes survived and were passed on. Individuals die, but genes live on as copies. Good genes survive through many generations, for millions of years, in the form of faithful copies. Bad genes don't survive. That's what bad really means, if you're a gene. Genes for making good wings help their possessors to pass on these very genes to the next generation. And finally, after countless generations, what we see is animals that can really fly very well. They fly well because through past generations, their ancestors flew slightly better than the poorly flying rivals who failed, right? So, I wanted to just get into some examples of some of the pterosaurs, because to me, this was pretty interesting to see. The pterosaurs, I kind of think of, if you have to name like flying animals from 165 million years ago, pterosaurs is not really a name you come up with. What's a name you come up with? Pterodactyl? Pterodon? And the other one was the Archaeopteryx, right? That was famous, found in Germany, and what its capacities were. But
Wow, that's the point, I think.
so, but those are the ones that you think of when you think of names, and that's kind of maybe from our generation or so. We were taught about what are the interesting flying creatures from prehistoric times. We think of Archaeopteryx, Pteranodon, and pterodactyls. And really, they have an image in our mind that make us think of a certain kind of creature, a certain size even, and so on. And as I looked into this, what's happened in the last 20 years or so has been phenomenal, the amount of information they've found. And so I wanted to show you some pictures of some of these and talk about the niches that they filled, because we kind of think of them as some kind of soaring kind of things, flapping things, but there's so many different niches. So a pteranodon is one. In fact, it was one of the first pterosaurs found outside of Europe. In 1871, they found them in Kansas, and it was part of the North American group that was along the western, or the Central American flyway, the waterway that was in the middle of the country at the time when there was a large ocean kind of going in the middle. 1,200 known specimens of this have been found, many of them in America. You can see a skeleton on the left, and you can see the pteranodon itself, or an artist's depiction of it on the right. And it was the first one that was found that was toothless. This one had no teeth. They found basically two different sizes of it that seemed to correlate between male and female. The smaller ones had actually a larger pelvic cavity probably to lay eggs more easily, and the larger ones were slimmer in the pelvic area. Okay. The Western Interior Seaway was where a lot of them spent their time, so they were often fish eating and so on. You can see the classic structure of a pterosaur's wing here, where actually it's an extension. Most of the wing is supported by an extension of the ring finger, what we have as our ring finger. The other fingers become claws in there, so it's arm bones, and then three claws, and being the thumb and the two others, and then the ring finger is what extends that all along there, along that length. So it's a very long extended ring finger on these. Those three there are the claws, that they always have claws. You won't see that in bats, and you won't see that in birds. Say that again? Right, yeah, those are the fingers, right, the digits. And there's three always, as far as I know, three that come out at that joint there. And then the rest of the wing is supported by an extension of the ring finger, okay? 1,200 known specimens of this have been found, so it kind of became the thing. It was found in 1871. I think as I was growing up, this is kind of the image of the typical bird that, or the typical creature that we saw at that time, Pteranodon. Generally a wingspan of about 4 to 6 feet.
That's side to side or one
Wingspan across the
total?
whole.
Okay, yeah.
The Dimorphodon, and this is showing the kind of classic structure of these animals, that they actually were often four-legged, quadrupedal. They'd walk on four legs around, and often because of weight considerations, they needed all four legs to take off. So they'd crouch down and push off with all four legs at one time to get them enough lift to start flapping and fly. Some of these were, you know, exceptional flyers. Some different species were not so good. The Dimorphodon, it looks enormous in there. It was basically about 3 feet long, so a little bit about the size of a dog, a little bit larger maybe. 4 to 5 foot wingspan. A very bulky head. First ones were found in England in 1828. 1858, Richard Owen, a famous name in anatomy and science, he was putting them together, building what the structure of them looked like. But you can again see the three fingers or toes, and then that ring finger would be going all the way out to the tip of its tail in this creature here again too. Again, I don't think that most of these creatures, pterosaurs really were not known to have feathers at all. They were flying with just flaps and wings and so on, unfeathered. This was a fairly poor flyer. It was somewhat squirrel-like, they thought. It might climb up a tree and then fly down to another tree, soaring down to it, kind of that way. You know, a lot of this is speculation based on the structure and the size and the volume of the bones and everything like that too. But you can see the teeth in this again that we weren't used to seeing in Pteranodon. So, interesting creature. This one is an amazing one. Quetzalcoatlus, named after the Quetzalcoatl bird that's, I think, the national bird of Mexico or so. Found in South America or Central America. Actually, the first ones were found in Big Bend National Park in Texas in 1971. So not that long ago. They didn't know about Quetzalcoatlus when I was in much of my schooling. 30 to 35 foot wingspan. It was as tall as a giraffe. A lot of discussion back and forth whether it was able to fly or not. There's some that say, no way, it's too heavy because it weighed somewhere, they originally were thinking maybe 150 pounds, and now they're saying more like maybe 400 pounds. So to have a 400-pound creature be able to fly is pretty amazing.
That'd be a really good Thanksgiving dinner.
Man, if you'd be able to catch it without it catching you.
Well, apparently it can't fly, so it should be easier.
Yeah. You're thinking of it as a turkey, I'm not.
Yeah.
It was called, the brand of it, and you don't see it in this picture, it was called the Northropi. Quetzalcoatlus northropi was the species, and it was named, you may have heard that name before in relation to flying, Northrop Grumman. Jack Northrop pioneered a tailless plane in the 1940s. He came up with a plane that could fly and didn't need a tail. And this bird has very minor tail ingredients, so it was called a Northropi after Jack Northrop. They usually scavenged and predated, they believe, small young dinosaurs, maybe just out of the nest, walking around, again, on all fours, coming up and getting small different dinosaurs. It was never really found near what would have been, and even though this picture kind of doesn't go along with this, but my research was saying not really near large bodies of water. So it wasn't a river eater, didn't eat fish, didn't do things like that. But probably able to fly and soar, they think nowadays. If once it got up and off the ground, it would soar for just thousands of miles flying along. Joanne?
They did a television program on this where they were looking at the musculature and how it moved. And they said it was a 3-hop move to get into the air. And once it popped on the second hop, and then the third hop, it was off the ground, and it flew. It really flew.
If you look at some of these things, yeah, and it's all speculation and engineering and genetics, and they look at the bone structure because they can't see the muscles, but they look at where the muscles would insert because of the portions of the bone, so that an anatomical studies of this, and then they start making computer simulations of these things, and you can get on YouTube and watch a lot of these interesting things that show and how they speculate. And you have to, I mean, it's fascinating, but you have to be careful and say, this is speculation, this is what they think. Other scientists think different things. The scientists that have the most money or support are able to put together these really cool, computer-defined models of it and so on. But, yeah, I mean, structurally it supports the fact, something like Joanne was talking about, its capacity to take off, and it was a 3-step move, she says, where it would hop twice. And I think what all the computer simulations I've seen is they get down real low on all fours and push immensely with the all 4 limbs that get them enough lift to get up. Flight, and again, I didn't get into this time, but flight is basically a couple of physics things, right? It's lift, right? And thrust and so on. And so they need those things that physics didn't change since the beginning of the universe. So that was necessary. I don't know if they would have had better success getting more oxygen in and out of their system to keep stronger because of the higher oxygen content of the atmosphere.
Not at that time, I don't think. That was during the Cretaceous. I think that was a Cretaceous when the oxygen was super high, but not 150 million years.
Yeah. So an amazing, think of that, the size of a giraffe flying.
And it also suggests that, they didn't have a large population, so it wouldn't have been that successful. So this would be the outlier. This would be the extreme edge of the capabilities.
Right. This, as evolution is going on, I think, or maybe I'll expand on what Joanne's saying, that there weren't, as far as we know, great populations of some of these. So this was an outlier. This was an experimental, this was an adaptation that was developed and evolutionarily succeeded for a while, and maybe would have done, many of these died out because of the asteroid strike, not because of other things, but, when you start looking at evolution, things rise and fall, and it's very complex what's causing things to succeed or fail, and then sometimes certain things succeed because all their competitors failed, really, right? And they happen to fit a niche or find a way to fill a niche. But they would have thought that this one picked off young baby dinosaurs out of nests and gobbled them up and ate them and had a 400-pound weight capacity that it could handle by doing that. So, pretty interesting creature. Many of them had these beaks, very long beaks, and they also had crests, and they saw on some of these animals that the crests seemed to be, again, sexual selection, more on what they believe were the males as some kind of display or way to, and we'll talk about sexual selection, I think, sometime this year too, as a way to interest members of the opposite sex. Usually males have sexual selection, and there's reasons for that as well that we'll get into. So the Quetzalcoatlus, and then I wanted to show you 2 more. The Geholopterus, and it looks much more like a bat or something like that, doesn't it? But it's not. Bats' wing structure is all the fingers perpetuate through the wing, right? So it was an evolutionary adaptation to flight that made the whole wing structure, and you could control the pitch and tenseness and tightness of the wing by having all your fingers involved in there. But this was supposedly a very, very good flyer, very quick and adept, very small, maybe a 30-inch wingspan. So not a, you know.
Looks like a flying Kermit.
Yeah. Usually a very big, wide mouth, and I'm suspecting that may be to help it as it's getting close to an insect, to get it here or here or here, wherever, as the insect's flitting around trying to get away. So you can see a dragonfly just ahead of it, and this Geolopterus is trying to capture, hone in on the dragonfly. You can see some level of, they talked about, and I don't think I know enough to talk about it that much more, but it had fibrous back legs and forelegs that were, whether they were feather-like or something else similar.
Just pinions, yeah.
Yeah, I can't really speak to it, but you can look in Wikipedia and it'll talk about it if you're interested in finding. You can see that the small little sections of grass and so on that kind of gives you an idea of its size. But I had no idea that there were flying pterosaurs that looked like this at all when I started looking at this.
Is that in Dawkins' book, the book you've been reading about flight?
No, I don't think it is. It is that much at all. Scott's talking about this Flights of Fancy book that I got for Christmas. Defying Gravity by Design and Evolution. So Dawkins talks about a lot of different things of flight. But yeah, very interesting creature. I was just amazed. But you can still see it's got the claws and the same kind of structure there. The first three digits of its structures there. And that always gives you this idea about evolution too, how true evolution is, that you don't see these different pteranodons and different creatures or all the different pterosaurs having a different structure to their wing. They all have the same family with the three fingers out there because that's what their common ancestor before them had. And that's how they developed these flight capacities and then diverted from that to fill different niches of catching insects or catching fish or whatever different things and developing an anatomy that helped that. So to go along with that, I wanted to show you one last one, the pterodostro, found in Chile and Argentina. And this is, it's just a picture because this is an interesting part of it. Something like 85% of its skull is ahead of its eye, right? So that's pretty amazing. And then if you look and define what's on its lower jaw there, what does it look like to you? Feathers? They're actually tiny bones that are hollow. What did someone say?
Baleen.
Baleen,
Yeah.
right. It looks like the baleen in whales, and it actually is surmised that they sifted out creatures from muddy sand flats and mud flats in the ocean and to get tiny little creatures and eat that way. So this would skim down or come along on the ocean and skim up different creatures. It also had small teeth on its top that it could maybe crunch different stuff as well too. This was found around 2000, originally in Chile and Argentina. It had maybe an 8-foot wingspan and was a filter feeder. There, in an area of 750 specimens were found. This was starting in the 1960s, I guess. 750 specimens were found in about a 24 by 24 square foot area.
Oh, wow.
So about the size of this chancel up here. 750 specimens were found.
So they must have lived in communities then, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And
Was there any young in there?
they found everything from young, from eggs to adults. So they have a very good picture of the aspects of its life. They're pretty sure that it was a fish eater or a filter feeder. It had difficulty launching. It maybe had to launch, maybe like geese do, out of water, like running on the water for a while to get up to some level of speed and thrust to be able to lift and take off. But yeah, very interesting. I've got one more, if it came through. Nope. There was one more picture of the skeleton of it, and it looked, except for the head of it there, it looked very much like a swan or a goose or something like that. It would have been in a similar type of niche in those days. Okay.
I want to correct what I said. I said Cretaceous for the Great Oxidation. It was the Carboniferous.
Carboniferous period.
Yeah, Devonian, Permian time frame.
Okay.
So it was like,
Prior to this.
yeah, 380 million years ago or so.
Yeah, when the insects were big, but prior to
Right.
dinosaurs.
Right, prior to winged dinosaurs.
Green dinosaurs, right? So, I was just amazed by the different structures of different pterosaurs, and I wanted to share a bit of that with you.
Mike, did they think it waded, or did they think it flew and actually collected the water as it was going, or did it wade, sort of put its head into the mud and that kind of thing?
I don't know if I have enough to say, and again, it's some level of speculation. And my research, I don't think I was looking to try to see if I could determine which it was.
The
But-
question was, whether, did it wade and forage that way, or did it swoop down from the air?
Right, yeah. So, variety of different types of flying creatures. I wanted to make sure that you get those ideas about what you need to fly, the capacities that make flight possible, and not as much the physics as you may have liked. But some of the things about flight, and talking about convergent evolution, because I think I want to make a point of looking at that a little bit more, of how that applies in other aspects of time. So we have some time for any questions or thoughts or things that we have. I don't think we brought a microphone down, but if you keep a short question or thought, and I'll pass it on to everyone else. Any kind of thoughts?
As you said, there's been a lot of work at pushing the time back for both birds and the flying reptiles. I'm thinking that they got numbers like 200 million now.
Types of,
No, but the
Age.
beginnings of flight for early birds is going back 200 million years, which would push the flying reptiles back even further.
right. Joanne's saying that as investigations, as more things have been found out, there's been a general pushing back of the time of this, that they're finding older and older creatures. That Geolopterus, I think that small adept insectivore, was only found in about the year 2000 in China. And and when you see this diversity, and one thing that I thought that I didn't know how to fit in, but it kind of fits into what you're saying, but Joanne's saying that the time goes back. One thing about it is that when you look at all the creatures that have found a way to fly, they've expanded so dramatically, so amazingly. If you think of all the different birds, I think they have like 10,000 species of birds, from cardinals and geese and all these things, and they think there may be twice as many, actually, that they don't have identified. So just an amazing fit into the niches of the ecosystem that flying allowed birds to do. And if you talk about bats, bats are something like 20% of all mammals are bats. Of all the species of mammals are bats. And so the amazing way that bats evolved to fill amazing different niches, from eating blood to eating fruit to eating insects,
Pollinators too.
pollinating, and all these different things. And then you look at the pterosaurs and insects. All of these creatures that developed flight really expanded such a great deal of diversity, right, in our ecosystem, in the world. And it's a much richer world because of flight. It's,
I've heard a rumor that birds are dinosaurs. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an evolutionary trait of they came from the limb of the tree of life that that dinosaurs came from. So they evolved on from that, not from pterosaurs, but from the dinosaurs. So that, you know, some common ancestors of pterosaurs and dinosaurs developed flight.
Is that like
And then-
the Archaeopteryx then?
And then dinosaurs went on,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And then dinosaurs went on, and dinosaurs then developed this flight capacity at a different time as well too, and became birds. So yeah, kind of fascinating to imagine how rich life on Earth became with flowers, flowering shrubs, everything that occurred basically because of flight. Yeah. So
Is still that of a theropod. Because the basic structure of T-Rex in very small sizes. So it says that there's something about that particular conformation of bones and muscles that is unique and allows you either to be a land animal and extremely good, or a flying animal and extremely good. You know, it's basically this form.
right. Well, yeah, I mean, once creatures came
The
out from
audience.
four, when you think of four-finned creatures that were in the water basically had four main fins that then developed as evolution came along into theropods and
They're all
four-limbed-
tetrapods. Yeah,
Tetrapods,
birds,
right.
dinosaurs, mammals.
Which is why you can't really have dragons, because dragons actually have 6 limbs, right?
Yeah.
They got 4 landing limbs and clutching limbs, and then the wings came out of nowhere, right? And where did, you know, if you start talking to people.
Or a Pegasus.
What's that?
Or a Pegasus, a flying horse you talked about early
Right,
on.
right.
You know, there's no precedent in the geologic record of evolution for a 6-limbed thing with a backbone.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you look at, you know, these creatures are very similar to the structure of what we are, right? Vertebrae, notochord, you know,
4 limbs,
four
a head.
limbs,
Yeah.
a head, 2 eyes, all those things are evolutionarily developed in there. I thought there might be a thought about, and we're running bad on time, so,
Okay.
but I thought there might be a talk, if flight is so good, why did some animals go back and give up their flight, right? Ostriches and emus, some of the larger, the elephant bird, the moa, the dodo,
Penguin.
penguins, all these animals. And basically, I think the answer to that is that there's a niche that they fit in. Oftentimes, you'll see flightless birds on islands where they were safer from predators, where they were and they kind of filled the niche that the predators would, and oftentimes became very large, robust animals. And to do that, they gave up the capacity to fly. So that's the fast evolutionary answer about why some birds gave up this great capacity. And some insects have too, right? Beetles that have a hard shell that covers their wings and they can't fly, right? John?
It seems to me that, you know, like evolution basically starts out in microclimate. I mean, in one spot, and they expand out in that spot. And if you have great growth in that spot, then the food in that spot becomes scarce and whatever. So to survive, you need to find a way to get out, expand, and find food sources.
Right, as
Flight would be one way, big heavy legs would be another, you can run further. But when you eat the flightless, all of a sudden you get to an area, you're big enough, there's enough food there, then you're not flying.
right, there's a lot of, John's talking about basically as animals fit into an area, they have to have their niche. If they all stay with the same capacities and the same food sources and the same predators and so on, they will diminish. However, if they develop a new trait, a new ability, then they fit into a new niche, and then they have some strengths and capacities in certain areas. And so then that's the evolutionary cause, natural selection. If you have something that allows you to pass on your traits better genetically more often, even a slight amount, it's going to pay off in an evolutionary sense. And that good trait that you have is going to develop and develop and develop. There's an interesting thing they talk about on islands. Generally, small animals that are on islands, small species of animals on islands get bigger because there's less predation. And so you'll see larger birds on small islands. You'll see larger of mice or different things like that. And large animals tend to get smaller because the food source isn't so evident and for a few other reasons. But so that's a pretty interesting, at least theory, that's what occurs on island cultures and why they're so different, and weird things happen on islands that you wouldn't ever anticipate happening in other places. Well,
All right.
we'll go on with some topics similar to this as we go on. You're talking about fall in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'm talking about.
I talk about flight,
Science of
and you
Autumn.
talk about fall.
Nice. Yeah. Well, the church theme for this month is change, and I thought it would be nice to talk about changing season and some of the science entailed in that.
So did you hear about the 2 pilots that were discussing flying and why they got into being pilots and so on at all?
I didn't get to overhear that. No.
So one asks, why did you become a pilot? What interested you in becoming a pilot? And he said, well, I wanted to become a pilot because I wanted to overcome my fears. And he said, oh, overcome your fears of height? And so he says, no, my fear of dying alone. So
With that,
boom. How often do airplanes crash?
very infrequently.
Just once.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for coming, and we'll see you in 2 weeks and talk about fall.
Right. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, above. Thank you.
Like, where were the survivors buried?
Right.
Yeah.